The helicopter came down beside the shipyard with a sound like the afternoon being torn in half. Everyone ran the other way. I ran toward the smoke. I am a single father with grease under my nails, and I pulled the unconscious chief executive of a defense corporation out of that cabin while fuel began spreading beneath the fuselage. When the Marines arrived from the base up the road, I was already calling out injuries like a man who had done it his whole life. One of them saw my face, stopped cold, straightened his spine, and said, "Sir." Then she opened her eyes and looked at me. "If you want to know why a Marine called an ordinary mechanic, sir, stay with me all the way to the end. My name is Owen Rourke, and for the last 4 years I had been a contract systems technician at the Carrington Aerospace Maintenance Facility on the South Carolina coast, which is a long way of saying I checked other people's work for a living and nobody asked me my name. I arrived that morning at 4:40 in a pickup truck older than my daughter, parked in the far row where the salt wind chews the paint, and carried my coffee past the fuel farm while the sky over the marsh was still the color of wet slate. I liked the hour. The hangar at that time belongs to the people who actually touch the aircraft, before the badges and the lanyards and the quarterly language arrive. I ran my hands along a tail boom the way another man might check a horse's leg. I did not think of it as devotion. I thought of it as arithmetic that could kill people if you got it wrong. That morning I pulled the maintenance history on a corporate aircraft that was scheduled to fly out at 4 in the afternoon, and something in the paperwork sat wrong with me the way a wrong note sits in a familiar song. The hydraulic control assembly had been swapped 19 days earlier under a batch order from a supplier I did not recognize, and the acceptance test had been signed off in a single afternoon by a name I could not match to anyone I had ever seen on the floor. The serial prefix was 3 characters different from the prefix on every other unit in that airframe family I had handled in 4 years. It was the kind of detail that means nothing at all or means everything, and there is no way to know which until somebody is falling out of the sky. I printed the page. I folded it into my chest pocket. I went to find my shift supervisor. He was a decent man named Dale Whitaker who had a mortgage, 2 kids in braces, and a supervisor of his own. He looked at the page, and I watched his face do the small collapse I had seen on 100 faces in my life, the look of a man who already knows the answer and hates that you made him say it out loud. He told me the batch had cleared corporate quality review, that the paperwork had come down from above his level, that the ticket I had opened 3 weeks earlier on a related discrepancy had been closed as resolved by someone in the engineering office in Charleston. When I asked who specifically had closed it, he told me it did not matter. When I asked again, he told me quietly that it mattered to my contract. I put the paper back in my pocket and went to work, because a man with a 13-year-old daughter does not get to be righteous at 9 in the morning. The reason the corporate aircraft was there at all was that Sloane Carrington was coming to decide whether the facility would survive the year. She was 39, the chief executive of Carrington Aerospace and Defense, the daughter of a man whose name was welded onto half the buildings in the county, and she had the reputation of a woman who had never once made a decision she could not defend with a spreadsheet. The floor knew she was coming the way a village knows a storm is coming. Men shaved. The tool cribs got organized in a way they had not been organized since the previous inspection. Somebody power washed the concrete apron in front of Hangar 2, which struck me as the perfect summary of how large organizations prepare for scrutiny. She arrived just after noon with a small procession, and at the center of it, half a step ahead of her by habit rather than rank, walked Graham Blackwood. He was the chief operating officer, 48, from a family that had been moving money in this country since before there were airplanes to move it into. He wore his suit the way some men wear a uniform, as proof of something. I heard him before I saw him, because he had the sort of voice that is designed to carry over machinery, and what carried to me was a sentence about headcount. He described the men around me as a cost center with legs. He said it with a smile, the way you say a thing you have said many times and have never once been challenged on. They came down the line, and Sloane Carrington stopped 6 feet from where I was kneeling at the open panel of the standby aircraft with a torque wrench in my hand and my sleeves rolled past the elbow. She looked at the airframe. She looked at the open panel. She did not look at me, not in the way one person looks at another, and when Blackwood said something about turnaround time, she moved on without asking my name. I want to be honest about that moment, because it would be easy to dress it up as an insult I carried around. It was not. She was doing her job with the information she had, and the information she had said that the man on the floor was interchangeable with any other man on any other floor. What I noticed instead was Blackwood. He glanced at the open panel, at the exposed hydraulic run, and something crossed his face for less than a second and then was gone. It was not curiosity. Curiosity is open. This was the expression of a man confirming that a door he had shut was still shut. I have seen that look in briefing rooms, and I have seen it in courtrooms, and I have seen it exactly once on the face of a man who knew a piece of equipment was bad, and had decided that saying so would cost him more than staying silent. I set the torque wrench down. I did not say anything, but I stopped being curious about the paperwork and started being afraid of it. They walked toward the executive aircraft, and I followed at a distance that would not read as following. The flight crew was doing a pre-flight, which is to say they were doing the pre-flight that the paperwork told them to do, and the paperwork told them everything was fine. Blackwood was checking his watch and mentioning weather moving in from the south-west. Somebody laughed at something. A ground handler pulled the chocks and stacked them without looking at what he was doing, because he had done it 10,000 times, and I stood at the edge of the apron with a folded page in my chest pocket and asked the question that has ended more careers than incompetence ever has. I asked who had put the final signature on the flight control system acceptance after the component change. I asked it plainly to the maintenance lead in front of two other men with my hands at my sides. The lead told me it had been signed. I said I understood that, and asked again who had signed it. He looked past my shoulder at the suits by the aircraft, and then he told me the file was closed and walked away. Nobody answered me directly. Not one man in that hangar would put a human name to the signature on a document that was about to carry a person into the air, and I have thought about that afternoon almost every day since, because that silence was the crash. Everything after it was just physics. I did not have the authority to ground that aircraft. I want to be very clear about that, because in the weeks afterward a number of people found it convenient to suggest otherwise. A contract technician can open a discrepancy ticket, and a discrepancy ticket can be closed by a manager, and the manager who closes it does not have to explain himself to the man who opened it. There is no red button on the wall. There is no phone number you can call where a calm voice takes your concern seriously. There is a chain, and the chain runs upward, and I had already learned that week exactly how far up the chain a question from a man in coveralls travels before it stops. So I did the only thing left to me, which was to go talk to the pilot like one working man to another. His name was Nolan Reyes, a former Army aviator, with about 9,000 hours in forearms like a bridge cable, and he listened to me the way good pilots listen, which is completely and without offense. I told him about the component swap, the prefix, the 4-hour acceptance, and the small deviation in the hydraulic pressure trace I had seen on the last ground run. He pulled the trace himself. He watched the numbers. They sat inside limits, near the top edge of limits, but inside, and inside is the word that runs aviation and the word that occasionally buries it. He told me he would keep a hand near the controls and watch it, and he thanked me, and he meant it. Then Blackwood came around the nose of the aircraft and asked pleasantly whether there was a problem, and the temperature of the whole conversation dropped 10 degrees. I said I had a question about a component. He said the component had been signed for. I said signatures do not carry weight. He smiled at me the way a man smiles at a dog that has wandered into a dining room, and he said that the chief executive had a call in Charlotte at 7, and that the weather was moving in, and that if I wanted to make policy I should apply for a position where they made policy. He turned to Reyes and asked if the aircraft was airworthy. Reyes, looking at a green box on a screen that a corporation had built specifically to end conversations like ours, said that it was. Sloane Carrington walked out of hangar 2 at 3:51 in the afternoon, ducked under the rotor arc without breaking stride, and got in. Blackwood did not fly. He said he had a call, and he stood at the edge of the apron with his phone against his ear, and I noticed that too, and I have never been able to decide what it means. I do not think he knew the aircraft would fail that day. I think he knew there was a chance, spread across a fleet, distributed across months, and that the mathematics of that chance had already been calculated by somebody and found acceptable against a delivery schedule. That is a different crime than murder. In some ways it is a worse one because it scales. I stood outside the hangar door and watched the ship pick up, nose down, and swing out over the marsh toward the west, and I did not go back inside. I have a bad habit that I picked up in another life, which is that I listened to rotors the way other people listen to a car engine they do not trust. The sound was clean for about 90 seconds. Then it changed. It was not dramatic. It was a small hollowness in the beat, the kind of thing you feel in your sternum before your brain finds a word for it, and I found that I had already dropped my coffee and taken 4 steps forward without deciding to. The ship began to turn back. That was the moment the men around me started to notice, because an aircraft that leaves and then returns is a story every ground crew knows the ending of. Reyes was bringing it home, and he was flying it well, and I could hear him fighting for altitude he was not going to get. Then there was a sound like a hammer hitting a bell inside a closed room. One hard concussive note that came across the water half a second after the airframe yawed, and the nose came up and then dropped, and the tail swung through an arc no pilot puts it through on purpose. Somebody behind me screamed. Somebody else said "God" out loud, and it did not sound like profanity. Reyes had maybe 11 seconds, and he spent every one of them well. He could have put it down short on the concrete and had a better chance for himself. Instead, he stretched it past the sheet metal shop where the second shift was clocking in, past the fuel farm, and got it onto the open dirt lot east of the yard where the company stored culvert pipe. I have flown enough to know exactly what that decision cost him. It is the loneliest arithmetic in the world, and he did it in the time it takes to tie a shoe. The ship hit hard on the left skid, rolled caught, and stopped at an angle with the tail boom folded, and the main rotor stopped in a shape that rotors are not supposed to make. It did not explode. That is not how it usually goes, whatever people think. Smoke came off the engine deck in a thick gray column that leaned east with the wind, and the fuselage lay canted on its side like something asleep. Then everyone began to move at once, and almost all of them moved backward. 200 people stood behind a chain-link fence and watched smoke rise off a wreck with a woman inside it, and every one of them was following the rules. I went under the fence line at the gap where the drainage cut runs through, and I heard Dale Whitaker yelling my name behind me, and I kept going. I want to tell you there was a decision. There was not. Somewhere in the wiring of a person who has done a thing many times, the running toward gets installed where the running away is supposed to be, and after that it is not courage, it is just plumbing. I came up the far side of the cut, cleared the pipe stacks, and got my first clear look at the aircraft from about 40 yards, and through the fractured side glass of the cabin I could see a shape that was not moving and a shoulder strap still buckled across it. The first thing I did when I got to the wreck was stop, and that is the part nobody ever puts in the story. I stopped for 4 seconds at the 10 o'clock position, upwind out of the plane of the rotor mast, and I read the machine the way you read a face. I looked for where the fuel was going, and it was going downhill and east, away from the smoke which bought us time. I looked at the mast and the head to see whether anything up there was still under tension, because a stopped rotor is not the same thing as a safe rotor, and the blade root will take your arm off a full minute after everything looks finished. I checked the attitude of the fuselage for the direction it would settle if the soft ground gave. Then I moved, and I moved along a line I had chosen instead of the line that was closest. Reyes was conscious, which surprised me, and he was pinned but breathing well, and he told me to get her out first. I told him he was not the one making assignments today, and got 2 fingers on his wrist anyway, counted, looked at his pupils, and looked at where his legs were. Then I told him the truth, which is what a man in that position is owed, that his airway was clear, that he was not bleeding out, that his legs were trapped but intact, and that cutting him free needed hydraulic tools that were 4 minutes away. He nodded once and closed his eyes and started controlling his breathing like a professional. When the fire crew reached the fence, I put an arm straight up and gave them a signal with my hand that meant 1 critical, 1 trapped, and I watched their lead see it and understand it and change his approach. The main cabin door was jammed. The frame had racked in the roll, and the handle turned about 1/3 of the way and then stopped against metal that was never going to move for a man with his bare hands. So I went around to the aft left quarter, put my palm flat on the panel until I found the recessed pull under the composite lip, and took out an emergency egress point that I would bet money nobody at that facility other than the flight crew knew existed. It is not a secret. It is on the placard. It is just that nobody reads the placard, and I had spent a portion of my life reading them in the dark with my eyes closed while somebody counted out loud beside me. Inside, the smoke was hot and layered and sitting high, which meant staying low, and Sloane Carrington was hanging in her harness at about 30 degrees with blood on her temple and her eyes half open. She was trying to unbuckle herself, which is the single most dangerous thing a person can do in a rolled aircraft, because the harness is the only thing holding your spine in a shape it likes. I got one hand flat on her sternum to pin her and put my face where she had to look at it. I told her, "Look at me. Don't try to stand. I'm going to get you out." She said something that was not words. I supported her head, took the load on my forearm, released the buckle, and let her weight come down onto me in a controlled way instead of the way gravity had planned. Getting a grown adult out of a canted fuselage through a side egress point is not heroic, and it is not graceful. It is a slow, ugly, deliberate business of angles and leverage, of protecting a neck you cannot see the condition of moving 8 inches and then reassessing. It took maybe 90 seconds, and it felt like a season. When I got her clear, I did not stop at the wreck, because the ground was soaked with fuel and the engine deck was still cooking, and I carried her out to the pipe stacks and around them and put her down on clean dirt about 70 yards upwind. 90 seconds after that, a small fire started on the engine deck, and the fire crew put it down with foam before it found the puddle. That is how close the arithmetic ran. She came around properly while I was checking her for the things you check for. And later she told me the strangest part of that entire day was not the crash. It was watching the man she had walked past 4 hours earlier stop being a mechanic. I was on one knee in the dirt calling out to men I did not know, sending 2 of them for the extinguisher rack on the culvert shed, putting a third on the fire lane to wave the ambulance in, telling the security lead exactly where I wanted his cordon and why the wind mattered. I had not raised my voice in 11 years. And every man I spoke to did what I told him without asking who I was, which is a thing that happens for reasons that have nothing to do with volume. The sirens came in layers, first the plant crash truck, then county fire, then the ambulances, and then, over the sound of all of it, a pair of tactical vehicles came down the access road from the north gate, because the Marine base is 9 miles up that highway, and a helicopter had just gone down in their backyard, and they had come because that is what they do. Marines came off those vehicles at a dead run with a corpsman's bag and a trauma kit, and they spread out across that lot with a competence that made everything else that had happened in the previous 10 minutes look like a rehearsal. I stayed where I was, on one knee beside Sloane Carrington, holding pressure on a scalp laceration with the cleanest cloth I had. The man leading them came at me fast to take the patient, and I started giving him what I had: mechanism, time down, level of consciousness. And he took 2 more steps, and then his boots stopped in the dirt. He looked at my face. He looked away at the wreck the way a man does when his brain is arguing with his eyes. Then he looked back, and I watched 11 years fall off him. He straightened up out of his crouch in front of 40 civilians and a burning engine deck and a chief executive with her head in my hands, and he brought his hand up and he said it. "Major Rourke, sir." The lot went quiet in a way I have only heard a few times in my life. Not silent because machines were still running, but quiet in the human register, every voice in that place stopping at once. I felt Sloane Carrington's head turn under my hand. I felt every man from my shift, men I had eaten lunch with for 4 instant, and the only thing I could think to do was the thing I had trained myself to do every day since I turned in my flight gear, which is to make it smaller. I said, "There's no major anymore, gunnery sergeant." His name was Caleb Dunn, and I had known him when he was a lance corporal, with a bad haircut and better instincts than his rank suggested, and he had been in the back of an aircraft I once put down in a place neither of us likes to name out loud. He did not lower his hand right away. He held it there while a corpsman knelt down on my other side and took over the pressure I had been holding, and he looked at me with an expression I did not deserve and could not return. Then he said the thing that I think changed the entire course of the next 6 weeks, because Sloane Carrington heard it, and because she was the kind of person who heard everything and filed it. He said, "To us it is, sir." They checked her at the county hospital and found a concussion, a laceration that took 11 stitches, 2 cracked ribs, and nothing that would keep her longer than a night. Reyes came out of the airframe 40 minutes after I did and kept both legs. I went home at 11 that evening and stood in the doorway of my daughter's room until I could breathe normally, and Lucy woke up anyway because 13-year-olds have radar. She asked if I was okay. I told her a man I worked with had a bad day and it turned out fine, which was true in the way that most of what I tell her is true, and she looked at me for a long moment with her mother's exact skeptical face and then went back to sleep. Sloane Carrington asked her questions the next morning, and she did not ask them of me. She asked Caleb Dunn, who had come by the hospital because Marines check on people, and who did not want to answer her. He told me later he gave her the smallest true thing he could find. He told her I had been a Marine Corps aviation officer. He told her that a long time ago a transport aircraft had gone down hard in a place that was actively unfriendly, that the man in command had kept 22 people from turning into a panic, had organized the evacuation, and had walked the wreck twice to make sure it was empty. He told her every one of those people came home. Then he stopped talking, and she could not move him further. What she did next was the thing that made me eventually decide she was worth working for. She did not summon me. She pulled my personnel file herself at 6 in the morning from her hospital bed and read it front to back, and what she found was 4 years of a contract technician at a pay band near the bottom of the scale, with a resume that listed 11 years of military service in a single line and no detail whatsoever. No commendations, no command history, no mention of rank. She told me later she read it 3 times looking for the part where a man like that explains himself, and there was no such part, and it made her angrier than anything else in the file. Blackwood got ahead of it before I even came back on shift. By the time I walked into the conference room on the 2nd floor with dirt still on my boots from the day before, he had already established the frame he wanted, which was that a fortunate accident of proximity had produced a fortunate outcome and that everyone was grateful, full stop. He said in front of 9 people that an old rank does not make a man an expert in how a corporation operates. He said it warmly, almost affectionately, the way you compliment a child's drawing. I did not argue with him. I have found that the fastest way to lose an argument with a man like that is to have one. Sloane asked me directly why the details were not in my hiring paperwork. Everyone in that room was waiting for me to make it a moment. I told her Carrington had hired a technician, and that they had not hired my past, and that I did not see a line on the application where the past belonged. She asked why a man with that record was checking hydraulic lines on a night shift on the coast, and that one I answered honestly, because Lucy is not a secret. I told her that my wife died 4 years ago in March of something fast, and that 6 weeks after the funeral I was offered a position that would have kept me away from home 19 days a month. I told her I had a 9-year-old who had just lost one parent, and I was not going to make her negotiate for the other. That was all of it. No bitterness in it, no speech, just a man explaining an arrangement of hours. Something in the room shifted after that, and I could feel Blackwood feel it too. Sloane Carrington looked at me for the first time the way she would have looked at a competitor's balance sheet, which for her was the highest form of attention available. And then the meeting ended and I went back down to the floor, where the federal safety investigators had begun laying out the wreck in a taped grid inside Hangar 3, and where a man who is not on the investigation team is supposed to stay behind the line and keep his mouth shut. But nobody had told me not to look, and I have very good eyes, and on the 3rd day a technician set the hydraulic control assembly on a padded table 30 feet away with the data plate facing the door. I read the serial. 3 characters. A prefix I had seen twice before, once on a page folded in my chest pocket, and once in a discrepancy ticket I had opened 22 days earlier and had been ordered to close by a manager who would not tell me who had asked him to order it. And when I went back that night and pulled the batch acceptance record for that lot of components on the terminal in the maintenance office, the sub-tier supplier certification traced up through a subsidiary that had been folded into the corporation 18 months earlier, and the executive with direct operating responsibility for that subsidiary was Graham Blackwood. I did not take that to Sloane. A man in my position who walks into a chief executive's office with an accusation against a chief operating officer is not a whistleblower. He is a resignation letter with legs. Instead, I went to find a safety verification engineer named Mara Keene, 35, whose name kept appearing at the bottom of documents that had been overruled. She did not trust me at first, which was correct of her. It took 2 conversations and a printed page before she opened a personal drive and showed me an electronic message she had written 7 weeks before the crash, addressed to corporate quality, flagging a variance in the certification sampling on that exact component lot and recommending a hold pending independent testing. It had a timestamp and 3 recipients. Then she opened the official verification archive, the system of record, the one that gets produced to federal investigators, and searched the same date range, and it was not there. Not deleted exactly. Never ingested. Somebody had adjusted a routing rule so that a certain category of flag from a certain desk never entered the permanent file at all. We put it together over 4 nights with the door open so it would look like nothing. It was not sabotage and it was not an assassination, and I say that plainly because the other version would have been an easier story and a lie. A lot of hydraulic control assemblies had come in at roughly 22% under market. A portion of that lot failed sampling on a fatigue characteristic. Testing all of it properly would have delayed a defense milestone by 9 to 14 weeks, triggering penalty clauses on a contract worth several $100 million in the same quarter the corporation was refinancing. So the lot was accepted, not by a villain in a darkroom, by a man with a calendar. And that was the moment the thing got much larger than one aircraft and one executive, because those assemblies had not gone into one airframe. Mara pulled the distribution and found them in 11 aircraft across 3 customers, 2 of them government. Sloane understood that faster than anybody when we finally brought it to her, and to her credit, her first question was not about liability. Her first question was how quickly we could locate all 11. Her second question was who had closed my ticket, and that is when Blackwood stopped being polite. He came at me the way men like him always come, which is not with a denial but with a biography. In a meeting with 4 board members present, he said that it was remarkable how quickly a contract technician had positioned himself at the center of a corporate crisis, and asked, with genuine-sounding puzzlement, why a decorated former major was employed at the bottom of a maintenance pay band. Because in his experience, men of real distinction do not end up there by accident. And then he put a document on the table. It was a redacted copy of a military mishap investigation report from many years earlier, and on the final page, under the line assigning responsibility for the decision to continue a mission with an outstanding technical caution, was my signature. I watched Sloane read it. I watched the doubt arrive in her face, and I did not blame her for it, because the document said exactly what it said. She looked up at me and asked if it was true that I had been found responsible for a helicopter accident. I said yes. She asked if I wanted to explain it. I said no. Every person in that room read that as guilt, and I let them, and I have been asked 100 times since why I did not defend myself, and the answer is that the only defense available to me required putting another man's name into a corporate conference room 11 years after he had earned the right to be left alone. Caleb Dunn had no such restraint. He drove down that Friday in uniform and asked to speak to her, and he told me afterward exactly what he said. He told her she was reading a signature and calling it a confession. He told her she was looking at the name of the man who accepted responsibility, not the name of the man who caused the problem, and that if she did not understand the difference between those two things, then she had no business running a company that builds aircraft. She asked him what actually happened. He said, "Ask him. He won't tell you." That's the whole point of him. So she asked me, and I told her once in the parking lot at 7 at night, and I will tell it the same way. 11 years ago, I was the officer in command of an aviation detachment supporting a movement of Marines out of a forward position, and one of my aircraft came up with an intermittent caution on a system that had been written up twice that week and cleared twice. A junior officer signed the acceptance and briefed it to me as within limits, which he believed, because that is what the trace showed him. Weather was closing. There were 22 Marines on the ground in a position that was becoming untenable by the hour. I made the call to go. The system failed en route. I put the aircraft into a dry riverbed 40 minutes from anywhere in the dark, and it was not a landing so much as a controlled negotiation with the ground. Nobody died. I got everyone out, and then I went back in and walked the length of the cabin twice with a light, because the count in your head is never the count you trust. The investigation afterward had to determine why a mission proceeded with an open technical caution, and that question has exactly one correct answer in a command structure. The commander decides. I signed the report, and I did not put the junior officer's name in it, because he had made a reasonable judgment from bad information, and because a promising 26-year-old should not have his life cut in half for the crime of trusting a maintenance system that lied to him. The consequence was not dramatic. Nobody stripped anything from me. I simply stopped moving. Boards are made of human beings, and human beings read a name attached to a mishap and decline to sign next to it. And after 2 cycles, you understand the shape of the rest of your career. I could have fought it. I know how. I was still deciding whether to when my wife found a lump in November and was gone by the following March, and after that the question of whether a committee of strangers thought well of me stopped being interesting. I turned in my gear. I moved to the coast because Lucy's grandmother was there. I got a job with my hands. I told Sloane Carrington all of that in about 4 minutes, standing between a pickup truck and a light pole, and when I was done she asked what I wanted her to do. I said, "Don't investigate me. Investigate these numbers," and I gave her the serials. She took them. She did not say anything reassuring, which I appreciated. And then she went and did the one thing that no one at Carrington Aerospace had done in 18 months, which was to follow a component backward instead of forward. The serials led to purchase orders. The purchase orders led to a sub-tier supplier in the Midwest with a good name and a bad testing floor, selling well under market. The supplier's controlling interest ran through 2 holding entities into a private investment fund. The fund had been capitalized 11 years earlier and was managed by a firm in which the Blackwood family held a substantial and undisclosed position. So it was no longer a story about an executive concealing a mistake to protect a quarter. It was a story about an executive who had personally benefited from every defective assembly the corporation installed, and had built a routing rule to make sure nobody could tell him to stop. He must have felt it closing, because he moved first, which is what they always do. He called an emergency session of the board on a Tuesday morning and reframed the entire matter as a question of executive judgment, meaning hers. He argued that if the chief executive publicly conceded that Carrington's safety verification system had failed, the corporation would lose the defense contract, the refinancing, and probably the county. Nathaniel Ashford, 61, chairman of the board and a man who had been at her father's wedding, agreed that it should be handled quietly. Ashford was not corrupt. He was something more common and more dangerous, which is a man who trusts numbers more than he trusts people and who had known Blackwood's father. And then Blackwood offered the board its exit, and it was elegant, and it was me. Assign the failure to the maintenance contractor, a contract technician with access to the aircraft in the hours before the flight, a man with a military record formally documenting his responsibility in a previous aviation mishap. A man who had, by his own admission, opened a ticket and then done nothing further, which reads very differently on paper than it does in a hangar. He recommended my immediate suspension pending investigation, and the motion carried, and somebody sent a facilities officer down to walk me out. I cleared my locker without saying much. A work coat, a photograph of Lucy at 9 holding a crab by the back of its shell, a torque wrench that was mine and not theirs. Dale Whitaker could not look at me. 3 men from my shift stood up when I walked the length of the floor, which is not nothing, and I nodded at them and kept going. Sloane Carrington had sat in that boardroom while it happened and had said absolutely nothing, and I walked out to my truck believing she had made her choice and that the choice was the company. Caleb was waiting by the fence. He had heard within an hour, because Marines have a network that makes corporate communications look like smoke signals, and he was angrier than I had seen him since he was 22. He asked why I would not fight for my own name. He said I had done it once already and look where that got me, and that a man is allowed to want credit. I told him honor does not need a room full of wealthy people to confirm it. He said that was a fine sentence and that it would look very good on a headstone. Then he shook my hand and told me to keep my phone on. What I did not know standing in that parking lot was that Sloane had stayed silent on purpose. She had let Blackwood build the entire structure in front of witnesses, every recommendation, every characterization of me, every assurance to the board that the component lot was fully certified, because a lie is only useful once a man has committed to it in front of 11 people. 2 days earlier, she had directed Mara Keene to make a forensic copy of the verification archive, the routing configuration history, the closed ticket log, and the procurement chain, and to place it with outside counsel before anyone knew it existed. She let him finish. Then she set a recorder down in the center of the table, told the board it had been running for the entire session with counsel's knowledge, and opened a folder. She put Mara's suppressed message on the screen with its timestamp. She put my closed ticket beside it with the name of the manager who closed it and the calendar entry showing who had called him 20 minutes prior. She put up the routing rule change and the credential that authorized it. She put up the invoices, the price differential, the holding entities, the fund, and the family. And she looked at Graham Blackwood and said, "Now explain why your family's fund earned money on every defective part we installed." He tried. Men like him always try, and it is genuinely impressive to watch for about 90 seconds. He questioned the chain of custody of the data. He suggested the routing configuration was an information technology error. He said the ownership structure was arm's length and that he had no operational knowledge of the fund's holdings, which failed the moment counsel produced a distribution statement with his signature on it from the previous spring. Ashford asked one question quietly about whether the defective lot had been knowingly accepted to protect the quarterly delivery milestone, and Blackwood hesitated for 2 full seconds, and that hesitation was the end of him. There was no arrest in that room. That is not how these things go either. The board suspended him before lunch. Counsel notified the federal investigators and the contracting agency that afternoon, and the matter went where matters like that go, which is into a process measured in years. What I remember most from what I was told is Nathaniel Ashford at the end, an old man with his hands flat on the table, saying that the board had spent 18 months trusting a man because of where he came from and had never once asked a question of a man who stood next to the machinery every night. He said it as a confession, not an observation. Sloane told them to call me back. Someone suggested that a better title might smooth things over. She said, "You still don't understand. The problem isn't that he needs us." Then she drove out to my house herself on a Thursday and stood in my doorway while Lucy stared at her from the hallway and asked me to come back and rebuild the entire safety verification system from the concrete up as Director of Aviation Safety. I did not accept in the doorway. I told her I would give her an answer in the morning, and I spent that night at my kitchen table doing the only arithmetic that has ever mattered to me, which is the one involving a 13-year-old and the number of nights I would be home. I came back in the same work coat. There was no transformation, no better suit, no walk through the hangar in slow motion. I gave Sloane 3 conditions, and I did not negotiate on any of them. Not one technician who had been pressured into silence would be terminated, including the manager who closed my ticket, because a system that punishes the people it broke will simply produce quieter people. Every safety finding would route to an independent verification group with a reporting line that no financial officer could touch. And any technician on that floor, at any pay band, would have unilateral authority to ground an aircraft on a real defect, with the burden falling on management to justify releasing it rather than on the technician to justify holding it. She agreed to all 3 before I finished the 3rd. We found all 11 aircraft in 19 days. 2 were pulled off a flight line the same week. Nobody else got hurt, which is the only statistic from that entire year that I care about. Mara Keene runs the independent verification group now and has a budget she did not have to beg for, and she is harder on my paperwork than she ever was on Blackwood's, which is exactly correct. Sloane Carrington did not turn into a soft person, and I would not have trusted her if she had. She simply started walking the floor at odd hours, learning names, and listening to men she had previously encountered only as a line item, and it turns out she is very good at listening once she decides someone is worth it. She asked me once, at the coffee machine outside Hangar 2, whether I ever regretted leaving the Marines. I thought about the photograph in my locker, Lucy at 9, holding a crab and laughing at something outside the frame. I told her no. I told her I just changed missions. She thought about that for a while and then went back to work, and there is nothing else it's between us but respect, which is more than most people get from a working life. A few weeks later, a detachment came down from the base to walk our new procedures, because the base has an interest in what we install in the aircraft they fly. Caleb Dunn brought them. A young Marine, maybe 20, watched him call a man in a work coat "sir" for the 3rd time in an hour, and finally asked him quietly why he did that when the man was not in uniform and had no rank. I was 8 feet away with my back turned, and I heard every word of the answer. Caleb said the rank stays on the uniform, the way a man carries other people doesn't. Then he turned around and grinned at me and said, "Good to see you again, sir." I did not return the salute because I have not earned the right to and because that part of my life is closed and I am at peace with the door. I did not mention any of the old ribbons in a box in my closet. I put my hand on the cowling of the aircraft they were inspecting, looked at the panel that was open and said, "All right. Let's make it safe before it leaves the ground." Sloane Carrington was standing at the far end of the hangar with a folder under her arm, and she heard it, and she told me a long time afterward that this was the moment she finally understood. Some men stop wearing the uniform. lose the title, and never once walk into a boardroom through the door reserved for leadership. And then the worst day arrives, and every single person in the building knows immediately who to follow.